Hi there. Welcome to or welcome back to Tiffany's Books, where I read books and I talk to you about them. I'm upstairs today. Downstairs is not giving me good lighting. It was atrocious, and I was like, no, I'm just gonna go upstairs. Unfortunately, I had my dryer going and it's a little warm up here, so we can't win today, but I wanted to come on and have a short conversation. Last year, I did this video about Kingfisher because I was really enjoying her writing, but I had noticed a trend with the women in her books being, while I liked the fact they were over 30 and plus size, they all kind of had a similar personality, or at least quite a few of them had a similar personality in being relatively naive to the world, even though they were older characters, and were generally inexperienced in terms of physical intimacy. And I think I had happened to just pick up most of the books that were like that to start off with. At the time, I had read Nettle and Bone, Thorn Hedge, Paladin's Grace, and Sword Heart, as well as What Feasts at Night, which I'm not really counting because that is a very different type of story. So all of these were fantasy stories with a older female protagonist. Thorn Hedge can probably sit outside of them as well, given what it was and how that character had experienced the world. But in Nettle and Bone, Sword Heart, and Paladin's Grace, the three women were in their 30s. They were all curvier women. They all had very large breasts, and they all ended up finding a very similar male love interest who was tall and muscular, but not chiseled muscle, like broad muscle, and very kind, but also gruff. And I thought that was at the time I was like, this is great, don't get me wrong, but are there diversity in these personalities? Because the women felt very cookie cutter, and so did the men at the time, but especially the women, given that these women were older, they were rather sheltered. So in Nettle and Bone, the main character, Mara, I want to say, is she grew up in a monastery. She wasn't a nun, but she grew up alongside nuns. And so she was relatively inexperienced sexually and relatively sheltered from the ways of the world. This worked really well for her character development because she went on this quest to save her sister, and she met tons of different people. She experienced the world a bit more and ended up falling in love with an older man, I believe in his early 40s, who was practiced with a sword and very kind of gruff, but also very patient and kind and loving. And then we had Sword Heart, which I read after that, which follows a woman named Hala, who is in her 30s. She's a widow. She's been married one time. She's been with one man. She didn't really like being with him. And she was very similar in body description to Mara. And she went on this quest, and in order for her to get her estate settled, we get introduced to the white rat that way. She finds this man in a sword who is obviously good at swords. He's tall, he's gruff, but he's very patient and kind, and he's trying to atone for a past, similar to the character in Nettle and Bone. And I was like, oh, okay. All right, that's kind of a repeat, but you know what? They came out at different times. I'm sure there are other things in between. Then I read Paladin's Grace, which has a traumatized male character who was trying to atone for something that happened to him, even though he doesn't necessarily need to. He thinks he does. And he is in his early 40s or about to be 40. Our main character is in her 30s. I believe she wasn't a widow, but she had an estranged husband who was the only person she'd ever been with. She was curvier. She was a little sheltered, a little shy. It was like this. I was like, okay, I'm enjoying this, but tell me there's some diversity. So I did this video last year talking about this. And since then, I have now read some more Kingfisher because, like I said, I love her. She's probably an auto-buy author for me. So this year I've read, I think, 4 Kingfisher books. Oh, I read another one after that. So right after that I did that video, I did read Byrony and Roses, which is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. and another romantasy from Kingfisher. And I was like, oh, I actually kind of enjoy this. There were some aspects I didn't like, but the main female character was vastly different than all the others. She knew who she was. She was young, but she was very educated in her ways of the world because of her standing in society. Like, not like, oh, she knew the ways of the world. No, she was like, she understood society and her expectations and things like that because of her growing up poor and having to function in a society that isn't necessarily accepting of those types of people. And she's very strong-willed, has all of T. Kingfisher's women up to this point too, like, so let's just talk about the 4 that I'm discussing, have very unique interests. So Mara was, I believe it's Mara, I'm gonna be so upset if it wasn't, but my head wants to say it was Mara, and I will double check it. My head really wants to say it was. So she wove tapestries, and Hala, I don't remember exactly what Hala had an interest as well. I don't remember what hers was specifically, but she also had some special interests. And I did like how Hala was constantly questioning oh my gosh, I can't remember the character's name right now, but I will put it up. But it was one of my favorite characters in the book. But Hala was constantly questioning them about everything. Like that character who was from the Temple of the White Rat would like get on topic, and Hala would just be like question after question after question, and like she was like a constant question asker. So there was that aspect. And then in Paladin's Grace is a perfume maker. So she has this interest of scents and smells. And Bryony, I think it's Bryony and Roses. I think I said Bryony. It's Bryony and Roses, I believe. She is a gardener. She loves plants. And so we do have like these unique personality traits in the women, but overall they're like, role in the book was very similar until I got to Bryony, and her role was incredibly different. And granted, that was probably because it was a Beauty and the Beast retelling, but then it had this kind of dark ghost undertone to it, which I loved that ghost story in there. So I was like, okay, so they aren't all like this. And I was like, damn, I just put that video out. So I was like, some point I need to address it. So I'm going to address it now. So then I read Bryony and Roses. That was at the end of last year. And since then I have read A House with Good Bones, which again has another slightly older female character. I believe she's in her late 20s. And I say older because I'm just so used to all the YA stories, like repackaged as adult with 21-year-old, 22-year-old, 23-year-old characters. And so I believe she's like late 20s or potentially early 30s in A House with Good Bones, but she is a researcher, she's an academic, and she ends up having to go and stay with her mother, and they deal with this like haunting in this house. And she was very much a like mirror, like a 180 of Mara, essentially, where she was experienced in physical intimacy. She was very sure of herself despite the situation she was in and wasn't really like intimidated by, there was never like, there was a love interest in that book, but this wasn't a romance. So there was a love interest, but it was like, she was never concerned about whether or not he had feelings for her. She didn't really care. She was just like, oh, he's kind of hot, like type of thing. So that character was very different as well. And at least she was experienced in the world. And that kind of made me go, okay, so we did have some variety. I just missed it in the books that I picked. And then let's talk about the romantasies. So I read Paladin's Strength, which is the second book in the Saint of Steel series. And that character is she's very tall. Another plus size character as well, and in her late 30s, and she was all confidence. Like she knew what she was about, she knew what she needed to do in life. She had a whole experience of the world and like sexual intimacy as well. And so it wasn't like I'm kind of intimidated by what could potentially happen with this man. And then his character was slightly different as well. Istvan compared to the other ones. I don't remember. Why can't I remember her name in Paladin's Strength? I cannot remember her name right now. But I liked her. And then we got to Paladin's Hope, which doesn't necessarily fit in this one because it was a male book. So there wasn't really any women for me to like compare, but I did appreciate that Galen was very different in personality from the first two from the Saint of Steel, from Esteban and Stephen, because they were very much hard on themselves for what happened with their saint, where Galen is when we get to be in his head, he is a little more in his head than he comes off in the other books, but he's the jokester, he's the comedic relief, he's the guy with the good joke timing, and he tends to view things a little bit differently about the world, and I do appreciate Galen, and I appreciated him all the other books. And so then the fact that I think it was hinted in Paladin's Grace that he was gay, and then it was confirmed in Paladin's Strength, and then he got his book in Paladin's Hope, and I really liked that story. Plus it was a dungeon crawler. But anyway, that's not to do with this. And then I read Paladin's Faith just recently. I just finished that one. And this has, again, a very different character. So we have, oh my God, I literally just finished their book. Marguerite. Her name is Marguerite. So she is actually friends with Grace, and she is the perfume merchant that sells Grace's perfumes. And we had her and Shane. And Shane is a struggle as someone who grew up with religious guilt, because Shane is the embodiment of religious guilt. Like Catholic guilt, like I didn't grow up Catholic, but I grew up with religious guilt. And he is a Catholic guilt meme. And he was a little difficult, but he was definitely still different than the other men too. So I was like, okay, so we're getting out of this like cookie cutter thing. Marguerite was very strong, very confident. She knew what she was about in everything in very different ways than the main character in Paladin's Strength. And also, again, in her late 30s. So I do like these are all older characters. And now we got introduced in here, Ren, who is another different personality. A little naive to the world, but in a kind of comedic way, because she is herself young. She's the youngest of the group. She's like in her early 20s, I believe, or her mid 20s. So she's the youngest of the group, and she's a berserker. So I love that we're going to get a berserker story in this series potentially, and have another different archetype of a woman. And then we got introduced to another of them who was, God, I believe it starts with a J. I can't remember her name. She was introduced at the end. I'm so bad with names, it's ridiculous. So she got introduced near the end, and she is, again, her story is going to be something. It is going to be something, because we're following these saints from the Saint of Steel, or the paladins from the Saint of Steel. So we've got introduced the next two, and I think there's supposed to be 3 more books, so not sure what the third, but I believe we're going to get Ren's story, we're going to get that other paladin story, and then one more. Maybe it'll be something with the Dreaming God, which would be interesting. So having read all of these recently, I do think they're, when I asked my original question of that video of, are all the women like this? The answer is no. It just so happened to be that the 3 books that I had picked up at the time had very similar female characters in it. So T. Kingfisher, even in the romantasy, has some variety, which I'm very pleased about, because romantasy books in general tend to be bordering that YA, new A, like young adult, new adult, like line. They tend to straddle it a little bit, where we get some very young characters in some extremely sexual situations, where if we didn't have the sexual situations, the books feel a little YA with the storyline and what we're doing with the plot and how the characters are interacting with each other. And so it's nice to have, in general, T. Kingfisher doing something different. But then I was like, okay, is she going to stick to a cookie cutter thing because that's what the other YA books are doing. They're sticking to the other romantasy books are kind of doing is, and I don't necessarily blame the writers or the genre for that. It's the publishers. Publishers don't want to take risks, and they're going with what is popular. It's the same with movie studios right now. It's why I haven't watched a lot of stuff. Everything is a reboot of something that was out when I was a kid. I don't want to watch a reboot. Give me something new. It's just frustrating. So, besides the point, I could go on about millennial nostalgia for a long time, but I do think a lot of the romantasy is hitting that millennial nostalgia bait, especially given that the storylines seem to have things in common with Hunger Games or like magical academies, or it's very much got that nostalgia bait thread to it. So I'm very pleased to say that I can confirm the T. Kingfisher's women are not all the same. So I just wanted to answer that question, and just give a little appreciation for diversity in female characters in romantasy books. I'm not a big romance reader, so I'm very pleased that I like these, and I love seeing diversity in female bodies in fantasy in general. It's very nice to see older characters, to see characters with diverse body shapes, characters who are tall, who are short, who are curvy, who are not curvy, like differences in characters, and to also see especially older characters. T. Kingfisher writes some very good older characters, like older women. The way she writes older women are like my favorite thing. That's the other one I read was A Sorceress Comes to Call, which had very, again, differences in its female characters, but doesn't really fit with the rest of this. So T. Kingfisher this year has, so I have read actually a lot. Oh my god, how many T. Kingfisher books have I read this year? Let's do a count real quick. Let's do a count since we're at the end of the year and I'm not picking up any more T. Kingfisher this year. So I read this year Sorceress Comes to Call, What Moves the Dead, Paladin's Strength, Paladin's Hope, and Paladin's Faith, and A House with Good Bones. I've read 6 T. Kingfisher books this year, and I think this has firmly solidified her as an auto-buy author for me, and I have not read anything that is below a 4-star from her, so solid up there in my favorite authors. So I hope you enjoyed this. This is just a quick little video I wanted to get out today, and I'll see you tomorrow with a weekly check-in for what I've read. If you enjoyed this, please give it a like and a follow if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you soon.